And I had looked at that picture of the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill.
His fellow soldiers threw boots at him while he prayed. They called him a coward, a lunatic, and a liability. His own commanding officer tried to have him thrown out of the army. Some soldiers told him to his face they would shoot him in combat rather than let him get them killed. Desmond Doss refused to carry a weapon, refused to train on Saturdays, and refused to quit. Then he went up a cliff in Okinawa alone without a single gun and saved 75 men while the rest of his unit had already run. Every one of those men had called him soft. The boy who decided guns were wrong. To understand why Desmond Doss walked into the United States Army and refused to touch a weapon, you have to understand what he had already seen a weapon do long before the war, long before anyone had heard of him, in a small house in Lynchburg, Virginia, when he was still a child. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, the second of three children born to William Thomas Doss and Bertha Oliver Doss. His father, William, was a World War I veteran, a man who had served in the trenches of France and come home carrying something invisible and heavy that never left him. William Doss drank. He struggled. He was, by the accounts of those who knew the family, a man who loved his children, but was not always able to be the father they needed. The moment that shaped Desmond Doss more than anything else in his childhood came during one of his father's worst episodes. William Doss, drunk and in a rage, pulled a pistol on his own brother Desmond's uncle and held the gun to his head. Police were called. The gun was taken away. The crisis passed. But Desmond Doss, still a boy, had looked at a firearm and understood, in a way that went deeper than words, what a gun was for and what it could do to a family. He made a decision that day that he would later describe as simply knowing he would never carry one. The family was quite religious Seventh-day Adventists, a denomination with specific practices that set its members apart from mainstream American Christianity. Seventh-day Adventists observed the Sabbath on Saturday rather than Sunday, which meant that from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, Doss would not work. The denomination also emphasizes a strong commitment to health, service, and nonviolence, though individual members interpret these principles differently. For Doss, nonviolence was absolute. He did not believe in killing, not in any context, not for any reason. He grew up in poverty, left school after 10th grade to help support his family, and went to work at a lumber company and later at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia. He was quiet, serious, and by all accounts very gentle, the kind of person who was easy to underestimate because he made no effort to impress anyone. He met Dorothy Pauline Schutte at a church function in 1942. She played the violin. He fell for her immediately. They began courting, and it was during this period that the war arrived. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The draft was expanded. Doss received his notice in 1942. He was working at a job that qualified him for a deferment. Shipyard work was classified as an essential war industry, but Doss did not want a deferment. He wanted to serve. He believed in his country, and he believed in the war the Axis powers represented to him exactly the kind of evil that demanded a response. He wanted to be part of that response. He just would not carry a weapon to do it. He would serve as a combat medic. What followed was not a quick administrative disagreement resolved through proper channels. It was a sustained, systematic effort by the people around Desmond Doss to break him, to make his life miserable enough that he would either pick up a weapon, abandon his Saturday observance, or quit altogether. The effort failed, but it lasted for months, and it came from every direction, and understanding how completely it failed requires first understanding how completely it was tried. Fort Jackson, the unit that wanted him gone. Desmond Doss arrived at Fort Jackson, South Carolina in April 1942, and the trouble started almost immediately. He was assigned to the 77th Infantry Division, 307th Infantry Regiment, Company B. His fellow recruits were men from across the country, working-class Americans who had been pulled from their normal lives and thrown into military training with the expectation that they would emerge as soldiers. They had a shared understanding of what a soldier was, a man who carried a weapon and used it. Doss did not fit that understanding, and he made no effort to pretend otherwise. The first day he was issued a rifle, he handed it back. He explained calmly and clearly that he was a conscientious objector on religious grounds and that he would not carry or use a firearm. He told his sergeant he wanted to serve as a medic. The sergeant stared at him. This was not a conversation the sergeant had been trained to have. Word spread quickly through the unit. Reactions ranged from bafflement to contempt. The contempt was loudest. The names started. Coward was the most common. Yellow belly, rabbit, Section 8. The Army designation for a discharge on grounds of mental unfitness, which was what his fellow soldiers believed he deserved. Some of the men were genuinely frightened in a practical military sense. A man who refused to carry a weapon was, in their view, a liability in combat. He would take up space. He would need to be protected. He would contribute nothing when the shooting started. The argument was not entirely irrational, and the men making it were not all simply cruel. Some of them were actually afraid of what a non-combatant in their ranks would mean for their survival, but many were simply contemptuous, and they expressed it freely. At night in the barracks, when Doss knelt beside his bunk to pray, a practice he maintained without exception, every night, regardless of circumstances, soldiers would throw boots at him. Not metaphorically, actual boots from across the room aimed at a man on his knees. He finished his prayers before he got up to retrieve the boots and return them without comment. He did not argue. He did not retaliate. He prayed, and then he went to sleep. And the next night he knelt again. The officers, for their part, pursued a more formal strategy. His commanding officer, Captain Jack Glover, made no secret of his position. He did not want Doss in his unit. Glover was a professional soldier who needed every man in his company to be fully combat capable, and a man who refused to carry a weapon was, by Glover's definition, not fully combat capable. He was not wrong about the practical challenge Doss represented, but the campaign he conducted to remove Doss went beyond practical concern into something more personal. Glover tried to have Doss transferred out of the unit. The paperwork was initiated more than once. Each time it stalled or was returned, partly because the Army's own regulations on conscientious objectors were more complex than Glover's superiors wanted to deal with, and partly because Doss, each time the transfer was proposed, made clear he intended to fight it. Then came the Section 8 attempt. Officers began building a case that Doss was mentally unfit for service, that his refusal to carry a weapon was evidence of psychological instability rather than religious conviction. A Section 8 discharge required a psychiatric evaluation, and Doss was sent for one. The psychiatrist examined him and found nothing wrong. Doss was, by every measure the evaluation could apply, mentally competent. The Section 8 path was closed. Then came the court-martial threat. Doss's refusal to train on Saturdays was classified by his commanding officers as insubordination, a violation of military orders punishable under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. They told him he would be court-martialed if he continued. Doss said he would accept a court-martial rather than violate his Sabbath observance. He consulted a chaplain who helped him locate the Army's own regulations protecting religious observance and drafted a letter to the War Department on Doss's behalf. The court-martial never happened. The regulations, when properly cited, supported Doss's position. He also had a physical altercation during training that has been documented in interviews. A fellow soldier, frustrated beyond the limit of ordinary contempt, attacked Doss physically. Doss did not fight back. He absorbed the assault and reported it through proper channels. The soldier was disciplined. Doss went back to his bunk and said his prayers. Some soldiers in the unit went further still. They circulated a petition requesting that Doss be removed from Company B before the unit was deployed to combat. The petition collected signatures from men who believed sincerely that his presence would cost lives. Doss was shown the petition. How he refused to break. The thing about Desmond Doss that his tormentors consistently misjudged was the source of his stubbornness. They treated his position as a pose, as performance, as the kind of idealism that would crack under sufficient pressure. They believed, because this is what people generally believe about conviction when they don't share it, that it was essentially fragile, that underneath the quiet refusals and the nightly prayers was a man who would eventually decide that fitting in was worth more than the principle. They were wrong, and the reason they were wrong is that Doss's conviction was not idealism in the brittle sense. It was not a theory. It was something he had assembled from specific experiences: his father's violence, his reading of scripture, his understanding of what his faith demanded of him, and it was rooted so deep that pressure from outside could not reach it. He was not being brave in the conventional sense of suppressing fear to act against his nature. He was simply being himself, and his self was not going to change because someone threw a boot at it. He was helped in the formal battles by two things: a sympathetic chaplain and his own meticulous knowledge of the Army's own rules. The chaplain, whose support was critical in the court-martial dispute over Saturday training, helped Doss navigate the bureaucratic landscape of military religious accommodation. The regulations were real. The Army did have provisions for religious observance, and those provisions, properly cited, were difficult to override. Doss had done his homework. He knew what the rules said, and he cited them precisely. When officers threatened him with punishments that the regulations did not actually permit, Doss quietly, without drama, told them so. This was not the response the officers expected. They expected either compliance or obvious emotional distress. Doss gave them neither. He gave them chapter and verse from the Army's own rulebook, delivered in the same mild, unhurried tone he used for everything else. Captain Glover's attempts to remove Doss from the unit eventually reached a senior officer who examined the case and concluded there was no legal basis for discharge. Doss had not violated any rule he was actually bound by. He had not been insubordinate in any actionable sense. He was qualified as a medic. He performed his duties, and the Army could not throw him out simply because his commanding officer found him inconvenient. Doss was staying. There is a specific episode documented in his oral history interviews that captures the quality of his resistance. At some point during training, after months of mockery and harassment, a sergeant made it his personal project to break Doss through targeted assignments and public humiliation, extra duties, impossible standards applied selectively, and being singled out for criticism in front of the company. Doss did everything asked of him. He met the impossible standards where he could and absorbed the criticism where he couldn't, and he did it all without visible distress, and the sergeant eventually exhausted himself and moved on to something else. Doss later said in interviews that he had never felt angry at the men who bullied him. This is a difficult thing to accept at face value, because it sounds like the kind of thing a man says in retrospect to make a better story. But the consistency of his account across decades of telling it, and the consistency of his behavior during the events themselves, the lack of retaliation, the lack of complaint beyond formal channels, the continued simple daily performance of his duties, suggests he was telling the truth. He also said, with more emotional weight, that he had prayed for the men who treated him the worst, that he had understood, in a way he could not fully explain, that they were afraid not specifically of him, but of the war coming toward all of them, and that their cruelty was an expression of that fear rather than a considered judgment of his character. What this suggests about Doss is a man with an unusual capacity to locate himself outside the immediate emotional transaction of persecution, to see what was happening to him from a distance that allowed him to respond with something other than the reactions his tormentors were trying to provoke. By the time the 77th Division shipped out for the Pacific First to Guam in 1944, then toward Okinawa in 1945, Doss had survived every formal and informal effort to remove him. He had his medic kit. He had his Bible. He had the small New Testament that Dorothy had given him before he left. He did not have a rifle, and he did not want one. And the men who had spent months trying to convince him otherwise were about to discover in the most direct way possible exactly what kind of man they had been wrong about. Hacksaw Ridge, what he actually did. The Maida Escarpment was a 400-foot cliff of jagged coral rock on the island of Okinawa, running roughly east to west across the middle of the island. The Japanese had spent years turning it into a fortress of tunnels, bunkers, machine gun positions, and artillery emplacements dug into the rock itself. American soldiers, looking up at the top of it, called it Hacksaw Ridge. Taking it was essential to the broader Battle of Okinawa, which was itself the final major land campaign before a planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. The 77th Infantry Division was assigned to assault and hold the escarpment. They would go up rope ladders and wooden poles on the cliff face, reach the top, and fight for ground that the Japanese had prepared to defend at the maximum possible cost. The first assault, in late April 1945, went up the cliff and gained the top. Company B was among the units that reached the plateau. They fought through the day, taking ground and casualties in roughly equal measure. Doss moved through the firefight without a weapon, going from wounded man to wounded man, applying field dressings, administering morphine, and dragging soldiers out of the line of fire. He was in the open repeatedly. He was under fire consistently. Then the counterattack came. On May 5th, Japanese forces launched a massive coordinated assault on the American positions at the top of the escarpment. Doss did not go back down. He had seen the wounded men who had been hit too badly to retreat on their own, men left in the open on the plateau as the unit pulled back. He stayed, alone, on top of a cliff held by the Japanese. In the dark and the artillery fire, he began moving through the wounded. What he did over the next hours has been documented in the testimonies of the men he rescued, in the official military investigation that preceded his Medal of Honor, and in his own oral history accounts. He found a wounded soldier, stabilized him, tied a rope around him, lowered him over the edge of the cliff to men waiting below, and went back for another. He did this over and over again. He had developed during training a specific knot for lowering a man on a rope, a double-loop knot of his own design that could hold a man's weight safely. He used it that night, again and again, working in darkness and under intermittent fire, and the knot held each time. He later said that he prayed between each rescue the same short prayer, repeated across the hours. "Lord, help me get one more." When the official count was made, the number of men Doss had lowered off the escarpment that night was approximately 75. Doss himself, characteristically modest, insisted the number was closer to 50. The official military tally was 75. He was not finished. In the days that followed, Doss continued to serve on and around the escarpment, treating wounded under fire, exposing himself repeatedly to get to men who could not get to him. On May 24th, while treating a wounded soldier, a Japanese soldier rolled a grenade toward Doss. He tried to kick it away. It exploded. He took the blast in his legs, 17 fragments of shrapnel embedded in his lower body. He treated his own wounds with the supplies in his medic kit. He lay in a shell crater for 5 hours, waiting for the artillery to ease enough for evacuation to be possible. When rescuers finally came, Doss saw another wounded soldier nearby and directed the stretcher bearers to take that man first. He waited again. When he was finally being carried back on a stretcher, Japanese sniper fire hit him. A bullet shattered his left arm. He slid off the stretcher, tied his broken arm to a rifle stock as a splint using his own bootlaces, and crawled approximately 300 yards on his own to reach the aid station. Captain Jack Glover, the man who had spent months trying to have Doss removed from his unit, witnessed parts of what Doss had done on the escarpment and heard the rest from the men who had been brought down on the rope. Glover later said, publicly and on the record, that Doss was the bravest man he had ever known. He said he had been wrong about him from the beginning, and that he knew it. The men who had thrown boots at Doss's praying figure in the barracks at Fort Jackson were among the 75 who had been lowered off a cliff by the man they had called soft. After the ridge, the price he paid, and what he left behind. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Desmond Doss's neck on the White House lawn. Truman, who was not given to effusive public sentiment, reportedly told Doss that he would rather have the Medal of Honor than be President of the United States. Whether Truman meant it precisely or was being generous to the moment, the record shows he said it. Doss, in his characteristic way, received the compliment graciously and probably didn't believe it. He came home to Dorothy, who had waited for him, and to Lynchburg, and to the quiet life he had always wanted. They married, They had a son, Desmond Thomas Doss Jr. They eventually settled in Rising Fawn, Georgia, a small community in the northwest corner of the state where they farmed and where Doss gave occasional talks at Seventh-day Adventist churches and schools. What the public celebrations did not show was the physical toll the war had taken on him. At some point during his time in the Pacific, the exact circumstances were never fully established, but Doss contracted tuberculosis. It was not discovered until after he returned home. By the time it was diagnosed, the disease had progressed significantly. He spent the next 5.5 years in and out of Veterans Administration hospitals, undergoing treatment for a condition that had taken hold in his lungs while he was doing the thing that earned him the Medal of Honor. During his treatment, doctors administered streptomycin, an antibiotic that had recently been identified as an effective treatment for tuberculosis and was being used on patients before its side effects were fully understood. One of those side effects, which became apparent only after extended use, was damage to the auditory nerve. Streptomycin could cause permanent hearing loss. It did in Doss's case. He lost the vast majority of his hearing not from combat, not from the grenade, not from the rifle bullet that shattered his arm, but from the treatment administered in an American hospital after the war. He used hearing aids for the rest of his life. He spoke about this injury with a measured sadness that was different from the way he spoke about his combat wounds. The combat wounds had come in a context he understood and had chosen, in a meaningful sense, to enter. The hearing loss came from care that was supposed to help him, and instead took something that could not be given back. He did not rage about it publicly, but it was a loss that shaped his daily life in a way that the scars on his legs did not. He also lost a lung to tuberculosis. When he was finally discharged from VA care in the early 1950s, he was a Medal of Honor recipient who was partially deaf, missing a lung, and still recovering from years of treatment. He was in his 30s. Captain Jack Glover, true to the public statement he had made after Hacksaw Ridge, maintained his relationship with Doss for the rest of their lives. The transformation in Glover from the commanding officer who had tried to court-martial Doss and remove him from the unit to the man who called him the bravest he had ever known was complete and apparently genuine. The two men corresponded. Glover spoke publicly on multiple occasions about having misjudged Doss, about the specific shame he felt at his own earlier behavior, and the specific admiration he had arrived at through watching what Doss did on the escarpment. This reconciliation became part of the Doss story as it was told over the decades, a narrative of a bully confronted by incontrovertible evidence of the thing he had mocked. It was real, and it mattered. But it is also worth noting what it required, not just Doss's extraordinary faith and endurance, but a specific, dramatic, near-miraculous demonstration of valor that most human beings are never allowed to provide. Doss had to save 75 men off a cliff in the middle of a Japanese counterattack to make the people who had thrown boots at him admit they were wrong. That is a high bar. Most people who are wrongly dismissed, mocked, and institutionally harassed never get the moment that proves their critics wrong so completely. Doss got it, and it changed things. But the fact that the change required what it required says something about the people who had done the dismissing. Doss spent his later years as a lay preacher, a farmer, and a living symbol of a specific kind of courage that American culture has always found easier to celebrate in retrospect than to recognize in the moment. He gave talks, he signed Bibles, he answered letters. He told his story honestly, without dramatization, in the same mild and direct way he had always done everything. He was the subject of a 1967 biography, The Conscientious Objector, by Booten Herndon, the first serious account of his story. The book introduced him to a generation that had not grown up knowing his name. Interest in his life grew slowly from there. Mel Gibson's film Hacksaw Ridge, released in 2016, brought his story to an audience of millions. Doss had died on March 23, 2006 at age 87, a decade before the film was released. He never saw it. His son, Desmond Jr., served as a consultant on the production and said his father would have been moved by it, though the family also noted some details had been dramatized beyond the historical record. The film was a global success. It was nominated for 6 Academy Awards. It introduced Desmond Doss to young people in countries that had never heard his name. In the years since its release, His grave in Sequatchie County, Tennessee, where he was reinterred after Dorothy's death, has become a site of quiet pilgrimage. What the film captured and what the history records is a man who was told in every available language that he was wrong about his faith, about his choices, about his refusal to be what the people around him needed him to be, and who simply continued to be himself until the evidence became impossible to argue with. The men who bullied Desmond Doss at Fort Jackson in 1942 were not monsters. Most of them were frightened young Americans who had been handed weapons and told to prepare for the worst experience of their lives. Desmond Doss walked into war without a weapon and came back having saved 75 men. The same soldiers who threw boots at him while he prayed were the ones he carried off that ridge. Subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon to watch our latest and coolest videos.